The office lights flickered once, hummed, and then died. At 6 o'clock, the building shifted into a state of automated hibernation. But Mark did not move. He sat at his desk, the pale blue glow from his monitor casting long, sharp shadows across the room. In his hands, the letter was heavy. It was standard, printed on crisp white paper, and contained exactly 3 sentences that ended his decade of work. Outside, the city traffic hummed, a distant sound that emphasized the suffocating stillness of the floor. Mark read the final line again. He stared at the ink. He listened to the hum of the cooling fan inside his computer tower, the only machine still drawing power in the entire wing. The air conditioning shuttered off, leaving the room stagnant and thick, with the smell of floor wax and ozone. He reached out, tapped the spacebar, and watched the screen demand credentials he no longer possessed. The cursor blinked. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse in the dark. He did not get up. He let the silence of the empty office collapse around him, waiting for the reality of the notice to anchor itself into his chest. Mark pushed his chair back. The wheels screeched against the carpet, a sharp sound that echoed into the rafters. He stood, his legs stiff from hours of immobility, and walked toward the exit. The hallway was a tunnel of shadow. He stopped before the heavy glass security door, the one he had unlocked every morning for 10 years. He pulled the plastic card from his pocket and pressed it to the scanner. The reader remained dark. He pulled it away, flipped it, and pressed it again with firmer pressure. A sharp, high-pitched buzz cut through the air. A red light flashed, pulsing like a wound. He tried a third time, sliding the card slowly, watching the machine. Nothing. The system did not recognize him. He was a ghost in the architecture of the building. He grabbed the handle, pulled, but the lock held firm. It was not just a door, it was a wall. He stared at the red light, the only source of color in the hallway, and understood the finality of it. They had purged his access before he had even packed his desk. The connection was severed. The betrayal was not in the notice itself, but in the speed with which he had been scrubbed from existence. The interior of the car smelled of stale coffee and trapped heat. It was 7 o'clock. Outside, the parking lot lights buzzed into life, casting flickering yellow patterns against the windshield. Mark leaned back, his head hitting the headrest with a dull thud. The silence of the car was different from the office. It was intimate, tight, and suffocating. On the passenger seat lay a thick envelope, the edges curled from the heat of the dash. It was the credit card bill, a month of accumulated interest and essential living costs waiting to be paid. He reached over, touched the textured paper, and pulled his hand back as if it were burning. The due date was printed in bold red ink, a countdown that had been running silently while he worked. He looked at the dashboard clock again. Every minute that passed felt like a gear turning in a machine designed to crush him. He was trapped in this small, metal space, surrounded by the physical evidence of his own insolvency. The bill was not just paper. It was a physical weight, a ticking time bomb sitting inches away from him. He stared at the steering wheel, his knuckles white, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, marking the passage of time he could no longer afford to waste. Mark pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen flared to life, a harsh, artificial white that washed out the interior of the car. He tapped the banking icon. The loading circle spun a rhythmic, mocking motion that lasted 3 seconds too long. When the balance finally appeared, it remained exactly where it had been yesterday. The numbers were static, lifeless figures on a digital grid. He refreshed the page, hoping for a miracle of timing, but the total didn't budge. He scrolled through the transaction history: rent, utilities, insurance. The automated payments were queued, like vultures waiting for a carcass. He toggled between accounts, searching for a buffer that wasn't there. His thumb hovered over the transfer button, but there was nowhere to pull funds from. The screen reflected his own face back at him, distorted by the glare, his eyes wide and unblinking. He realized then that the numbers were not just data. They were the limits of his reality. His entire life was tied to this single, narrow stream of incoming capital, and the tap had been turned off. He closed the app, dropped the phone onto the center console, and watched the light fade. The dark returned, thicker than before, pressing against the glass. He had relied on this digital bridge to carry him across the month, and now it had simply dissolved. Mark traced the path of his career, not as a series of achievements, but as a singular, fragile connection. For a decade, his existence had been anchored to one source, one company, one paycheck, one decision by an executive he had never met. That was the architecture of his ruin. He had traded his time for a salary, believing the agreement was mutual, but the math proved otherwise. He had built his life on a single point of failure, and the moment that point vanished, his entire foundation buckled. It was a structural error. By tying his survival to one employer, he had handed the keys to his future to someone else. They held the leverage. He held only the obligation to show up. He had spent 10 years optimizing his labor, yet he had done nothing to build an alternative. Every hour he invested in the office was an hour he took away from building his own system. Now, the office was dark, the connection was severed, and the fragility of his position was laid bare. He was not an architect of his own income. He was a tenant in someone else's business model. This was the trap. When you rely on one stream, you do not possess security. You possess a temporary contract that can be terminated without warning. He was finally seeing the mechanism of his own dependency. Mark looked at the paper on the passenger seat. The credit card statement. A simple document, yet it carried a weight that defied its size. The due date was 4 days away. The amount was fixed. The income meant to cover it was gone. This was the trap of compounding debt. While his salary had vanished in a single afternoon, the obligations did not pause to consider his circumstances. Interest rates ticked upward in the background, a silent, relentless machine. Every hour he spent sitting in the dark, the cost of his delay increased. Rent was not a static figure. It was a deadline. The electricity, the insurance, the credit minimums, they were all moving parts of a system designed to extract value, regardless of his employment status. He had lived under the assumption that his income would always be there to meet them. Now he saw the truth. Debt is a predator that feeds on time. It does not care about talent or effort or past loyalty. It only cares about the schedule. He reached over and touched the edge of the paper. The numbers were not just dead, they were a countdown. He was no longer working toward a goal. He was racing against a clock that was rigged to ensure he would eventually lose. The math was cruel, precise, and completely indifferent to his survival. Mark realized that for 10 years, he had been selling his life in 60-minute increments. He had believed that working harder would increase his returns, but the system had a hard limit. No matter how much effort he poured into his tasks, there were only 24 hours in a day. He was trading a finite resource for a fixed price. This is the ultimate bottleneck. When your income is tied directly to your labor, your output is capped by your physical endurance. You can optimize, you can hustle, and you can stay late, but you cannot multiply your time. He had reached that ceiling. Every promotion he had chased had only demanded more of his hours, not more of his leverage. He was running a race where the track never grew longer, yet the demands grew heavier. He looked at his hands, the tools of his trade, and understood the futility of his past strategy. He had been trying to beat the system by being the most efficient gear in the machine, but a gear only spins as fast as the mechanism allows. There was no room for expansion in a model where his survival was tethered to his presence. He was locked in a cage built of his own hours, and he had finally hit the bars. Mark stopped staring at his hands and looked out at the city skyline. There was a different way to play this game. He had been chasing stability, but stability was a myth designed for the vulnerable. The wealthy did not seek a single anchor. They sought redundancy. He watched a plane bank over the harbor and realized their financial structures were built like that aircraft. Multiple engines, overlapping systems, none of them fatal if one failed. They did not rely on one paycheck because they knew that a single point of failure was a death sentence. He felt a sharp, sudden shift in his perspective. It was not about working harder. It was about building a structure that did not collapse when he stepped away. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he replayed the last decade. He had been building a cage while others were building an ecosystem. A quiet curiosity replaced the panic in his chest. If he could strip away the need for a single employer, what would be left? He pulled a notebook from the glove box and opened it to a blank page. The math of his life had been a subtraction problem, but for the first time, he started to see it as an addition problem. He was not looking for a new job. He was looking for a new architecture. Mark pulled his phone from the console, his thumb hovering over the screen. He searched for Sarah. They had worked together for years until the restructuring cuts tore through the department. He remembered the morning she was handed her notice. Most people had gone pale, their voices trembling as they packed their desks. Sarah had simply closed her laptop and walked to the break room for coffee. She had survived 3 such layoffs in 5 years, yet her lifestyle never dipped. Her mortgage was never late, and she never seemed to carry the weight of a looming deadline. Mark had assumed she had a secret safety fund or perhaps a wealthy family. Now, sitting in the silence of his car, he realized those excuses were just mirrors of his own limitation. She had not been lucky. She had been operating on a different frequency. While he was busy perfecting his resume to beg for another position, she was busy building a wall of assets that shielded her from the volatility of the market. He looked at the termination notice again, but the panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating desire to learn how she had done it. He needed to stop reacting to the storm and start building the house. Mark traced the logic of Sarah's resilience. It was not a hidden inheritance or a secret windfall. It was an architecture of 3 distinct pillars. First, an e-commerce store that processed orders while she slept, turning digital traffic into consistent revenue. Second, quarterly dividend payouts from a diversified portfolio, providing a steady drip of passive capital regardless of her employment status. Third, a rental property that generated monthly cash flow, independent of any corporate board or layoff cycle. He realized the genius of her position. When one stream slowed, the others simply picked up the slack. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem. Mark looked at his own bank statement, a single, thin line of income tied entirely to his physical presence at a desk. He had been trading hours for dollars, hitting a hard ceiling that made growth impossible. Sarah had decoupled her survival from her labor. She did not work for a paycheck. She worked on the systems that produced the paycheck. The math was stark, simple, and undeniable. He saw that true wealth was not about a lucky break, but about stacking independent cash flows until the structure was too heavy to be toppled by a single market event. He finally understood the shift. He had to stop being a participant and start being an architect. The gap between his current reality and the stability he witnessed was not just a difference in bank balances. It was a chasm of vulnerability. Mark stared at the dashboard of his car, the silence amplified by the weight of his own financial dependency. He lived in a state of constant, low-level friction, where every expense was a potential point of failure. If his car broke down tomorrow, his budget would shatter. If his rent increased, his lifestyle would collapse. This was the cost of the traditional model, an existence defined by the absence of a safety net. He looked at his phone, realizing that most people lived exactly like this, walking a tightrope without a harness. He felt the cold truth of it. When your income relies on a single source, you are not an owner of your life. You are a hostage to it. Every hour he spent trading time for dollars was an hour lost in building a system that could endure without him. He could feel the ticking clock. The next market shift, the next corporate restructuring, or the next personal emergency would not ask for his permission. It would simply arrive. He needed to stop viewing his finances as a static list of debts and start viewing them as a project to be engineered. The peace of mind Sarah possessed was not a luxury. It was the direct result of a structural defense system. He decided then to stop waiting for stability and start constructing it. Mark tapped his phone screen, the banking application glowing in the dim car interior. The date sat at the top like a red alert, 4 days until rent was due. It was not a distant concern. It was a physical weight pressing against his chest. He scrolled to his balance. The figure was static, insufficient, and shrinking. Every day that passed was a day closer to a hard, unforgiving deadline. This was the guillotine. It did not care about his effort, his history, or his professional dedication. It only cared about the date. He watched the seconds tick by on his dashboard clock, each one a reminder that his traditional model had no mechanism for survival. He had been conditioned to wait for a paycheck, but the payroll system was gone. The debt did not pause for his unemployment. It compounded. He felt the cold reality. If he did not change his financial architecture by the time that deadline hit, the consequences would be immediate and absolute. This was not a theoretical problem for the future. It was a crisis of the present. He stared at the unpaid bill on the passenger seat, the paper edges sharp and demanding. He realized then that he was not just fighting for a rent payment. He was fighting to stop being a victim of a system he could not control. The time for deliberation had passed. The time for building had begun. The panic faded into a sharp, clinical focus. Mark realized the error was not in his work ethic, but in the model itself. He had been trading hours for dollars, a finite equation with a hard ceiling. No matter how hard he worked, his income was tethered to his physical presence. This was the fundamental trap. He looked at the empty seat next to him, visualizing the architecture of resilience. Sarah did not work harder. She worked differently. Her income was not a single, fragile stream. It was a stack of independent systems, digital products, dividends, and automated assets. When one slowed, the others sustained her. This was the critical evolution. It was the transition from labor-based income to system-based income. Labor-based income is a trap because it requires your constant, active effort to survive. System-based income is an engine that functions independently of your presence. He understood now that wealth was not the result of a single lucky break or a high salary. It was the result of layering consistent, automated cash flows until the structure was robust enough to endure market volatility. He was done being a participant in a cycle that discarded him at the first sign of trouble. He was ready to stop being a laborer and start being an architect. The shift was absolute. Survival now demanded a new way of building. The difference between labor and systems is the difference between a bucket and a pipe. When you rely on labor, you are the one carrying the water. If you stop moving, the flow stops. Your energy is the limiting factor. Systems, however, are the pipes. Once constructed, they move the water for you, day and night, regardless of your physical state. Mark looked at his hands, calloused from years of trading time for a paycheck, and realized he had been working against the laws of physics. Labor does not scale. You cannot work 25 hours in a day. You cannot duplicate your presence in 3 places at once. But a system has no such ceiling. An e-commerce store does not sleep. A dividend distribution does not take a lunch break. A rental asset does not demand a vacation. This is the core of the power he had ignored. When he built a system, he was not just building a product. He was building a version of himself that existed outside of time. He imagined the quiet potential of a machine that generated value while he slept. The realization hit him with the force of a physical shift. He was no longer limited by his own heartbeat. The ceiling had vanished. The potential was now as infinite as the architecture he chose to design. The math of freedom is cold, precise, and entirely unforgiving. Total income must equal the sum of multiple, independent streams. Mark wrote the equation on a napkin, staring at the stark reality of his previous life. A single paycheck is not an income. It is a single point of failure. When that source hits zero, the entire structure collapses. The logic of wealth is simple addition. If stream A fails, stream B remains. If stream B slows, stream C continues to flow. This is the roadmap out of the trap. He started to map his own potential assets. A digital product that solves a recurring problem. A distribution system that leverages existing demand. A small equity stake in a growing venture. These are not just line items on a balance sheet. They are independent engines of survival. By stacking these streams, he was no longer dependent on the whims of a single employer. He was building a floor beneath his feet that no layoff could reach. The math shifted his perspective from desperate preservation to calculated expansion. One stream is a tether. 3, 4, or 5 streams. That is a foundation. Freedom is not an abstract concept. It is the calculated result of a diversified architecture where the total sum is always greater than the failure of any single part. Diversification is often mislabeled as a luxury for the wealthy. This is a lie that keeps the vulnerable trapped in a state of perpetual risk. Mark saw the truth now. Layering income streams is not about excess or greed. It is about the fundamental responsibility of protecting one's future. When you rely on a single source of income, you are gambling with your survival. You are leaving your rent, your food, and your security entirely at the mercy of factors you cannot control. That is not stability. That is a reckless lack of planning. To diversify is to act as a guardian of your own life. It is the conscious decision to build a defensive perimeter that no single market shift or corporate decision can breach. Every new asset he planned was a brick in a wall designed to withstand the storms that had previously devastated his life. He felt the weight of this responsibility settle into his chest, not as a burden, but as a clarity of purpose. If he failed to build, he was choosing to remain exposed. The pursuit of multiple streams is the only way to eliminate the fragility of his past. He turned the page, ready to draft the blueprints for a structure that was finally, truly his own. The pivot from labor to system is the turning point of the entire architecture. Mark began to categorize his potential assets, not by what they paid, but by how they functioned. A digital product is a delivery system. It runs while you sleep. A distribution network is a machine. It moves value without your direct intervention. This is how you build an ecosystem. Instead of trading hours for dollars, you build assets that scale. When you write a piece of software, record a course, or establish a proprietary distribution channel, you are creating a digital employee. It works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It does not require a termination notice. It does not suffer from market volatility in the way a single salary does. By stacking these systems, you effectively decouple your survival from any single employer or event. You are no longer a participant in a cycle of dependency. You are the architect of your own distribution. Every asset added to the ecosystem reinforces the structure, making it harder for any external force to disrupt your life. Stop focusing on the paycheck. Start focusing on the machine. The goal is to build an environment where the assets handle the labor and you handle the strategy. This is not just a change in income. It is a change in the fundamental nature of your survival. Wealth is not a single lucky break. It is the result of layering consistent cash flows until the structure stands on its own. Mark visualized the architecture. Each income stream was a support beam. Dividend payouts, digital assets, rental yields, they intersected, creating a grid that held even when one point collapsed. This is the definition of market proof. When the market shifts, the structure flexes rather than breaks. You do not just survive the volatility. You exist alongside it. He calculated the weight of his new foundation. Every asset he integrated added a layer of redundancy. The pressure of rent, bills, and debt, which once felt like a crushing physical weight, now seemed distant. It was no longer a personal failure if a single stream slowed. It was merely a maintenance task in a larger, self-sustaining system. He felt the shift from defensiveness to absolute control. The structure was built to last, designed to function regardless of external interference. He was no longer trading hours for a shrinking paycheck. He was maintaining a machine that generated its own momentum. The fragility of his past had been replaced by the stability of a complex, resilient design. This is the architecture of power. It is the final state where your survival is decoupled from the economy and fully integrated into your own assets. The difference between who you were and who you are becoming is a matter of perspective. Most people view the economy as a terrain they must navigate to survive. They look for jobs. They wait for raises. They hope for stability. This is the perspective of a participant. You are a cog in a machine built by someone else. But look at the architecture again. You have the tools to build your own. You have the capacity to construct a system that dictates its own terms. Stop checking the job boards. Start checking the flow of capital. The world does not reward those who simply show up. It rewards those who understand the mechanics of value. When you stop trading your time for a paycheck, you stop being a variable in someone else's equation. You become the equation. This is the moment to stop asking for permission to prosper. The economic landscape is not a static reality. It is a fluid structure waiting for you to shape it. You are not a guest in this market. You are a designer. Every system you build, every asset you integrate, and every flow you secure is a brick in your own foundation. You are moving from the passenger seat to the control room. This is not about wealth as a destination. It is about authority as a state of being. Knowledge without application is merely a collection of ideas. You have seen the architecture. You have identified the flaws in the traditional model. Now comes the execution. Theoretical understanding is the first step, but the market requires precise, data-driven action to scale. Building a resilient structure takes more than intent. It takes a blueprint. This is why the operator capital exists. We do not deal in platitudes or generic advice. We provide deep dives into business systems, cash flow management, and the mechanics of financial strategy that keep the machine running. You have the vision to design your own economic future. We provide the technical framework to sharpen that design. Every week, we break down the systems that sustain wealth so you can stop guessing and start building. The transition from participant to architect is a continuous process of refinement. It requires constant analysis, calculated risk, and the right tools. Subscribe to the Operator Capital. Join a community that treats money as a system to be engineered rather than a salary to be earned. The next phase of your financial evolution starts with the right information. Take the role of the architect. Master the flow of capital. We will provide the strategy. It is time to build.